This is my response to Thomas Sowell's The Man Without One, his after-school talk. His after-school talk on traditional and cosmic justice, or social justice.
I guess the first thing to do is to define what cosmic justice is as distinguished from whatever other kind of justice we may be familiar with. Traditional justice, I guess we can summarize, at least in the American tradition.
So Thomas Sowell talks about things that he doesn't know so well, and we need to go into it. We're starting off super strong here. We want to talk about traditional justice from the American standard. Let's do that.
As applying the same rules and the same standards to everybody.
America was giving away millions of acres of land in the West and the Midwest, which meant that there was a willingness to give the white peasants from Europe an economic base. And yet it refused to give its black peasants from Africa, who came here involuntarily in chains and had worked free for 244 years, any kind of economic base.
Cosmic justice is very different. It means equalizing the prospects of everybody.
I was ready to prostitute myself.
And those two things are not only different in concept, they are wholly incompatible with one another.
But not only did they give the land, they built land-grant colleges.
If you apply the same rules and standards to everybody.
Yeah, I was using steroids thinking it was going to help me.
In baseball, Mark McGwire is going to hit 70 home runs.
She hit 49 home runs as a rookie in 1987. Were you using steroids at that time?
No.
And there are going to be other people who will spend an entire career.
I started using it the winter of 93, 94.
Without hitting 70 home runs.
You said you used steroids during the 90s.
And there are going to be other people who will spend an entire career.
When we get to the great seasons of 97, 98, 99, 2000, then you start hitting home runs once every 7.5 times at bat, once every 8 times at bat.
Without hitting 70 home runs.
Could you have done those things? Could you have hit 70 home runs? Could you have had a home run ratio greater than anything Babe Ruth did in his time without using steroids?
Including people in the Hall of Fame like Luke Appling, who twice won the batting championship.
You know, I think it was I believe it was the winter of 89 into 90. I was given a couple of weeks worth, tried it.
The entire career.
Do you think that you would have hit nearly 600 home runs, that you would have hit 70 homers one year and 65 homers another year and topped 50 4 times if you had never touched anything stronger than a protein shake?
So if you want the one thing or the other, you can go for it. But the one thing you cannot do is pursue the two things simultaneously.
The traditional justice is U.S. justice. We don't want it.
Or rather, you cannot successfully do that. The Supreme Court has been pursuing the two things simultaneously for quite a while.
And he doesn't give an example of how they do that.
Leading to a lot of 5-4 decisions and inconsistent decisions. The requirements for the two kinds of justice are very different. The requirement for treating everyone the same is very simple.
And when has the U.S. ever treated everyone the same? Plus, who wants to be treated the same? Do you treat your kids the same? Does it make sense to treat everyone the same?
It's mass-produced. The requirements for cosmic justice must be handmade and tailored to each individual case.
So this again is another area where he's just talking out his ass. One justice is mass-produced, the other one is tailor-made. You don't get justice without somebody imposing the justice, no matter what the justice is. Even if it's justified justice, somebody has to impose the justice. It's just how it is. Every now and then you get karma, right? And karma's karma, but that's not necessarily justice. So, Thomas Sowell.
It's much more complex.
Yes.
There is still a word kind of in our vernacular that comes from that period before Social Security, and the word is the poorhouse.
Yes, that's right.
You would hear it from your parents or your grandparents, you're going to put me in the poorhouse. The poorhouse was an actual thing, and it was basically a charitable run organization. Sometimes it would get a little bit of money from the town or from the city or the state, where when elderly people who could no longer make income, they would just get put in the poorhouse. These were the most decrepit, disgusting, degrading, undignified places that you could put elderly people.
And it requires a much larger amount of government power. Some third party must intervene to determine whether the outcomes are right, whether the prospects are right.
Yeah.
And if you look at some of the poverty statistics from the 1930s, it is horrifying.
The very same words have entirely different meanings within these two frameworks. In fact, as I mentioned in the preface to the book, what really set me off a few years ago to finish it up was a discussion with one of my colleagues at Stanford University, who shall be anonymous in deference to the libel laws, who talked about a level playing field. And it became painfully clear that what he called the level playing field is what I would have called a tilted playing field. Tilted so as to produce the results that he wanted.
One of the reasons why I think retirement age is so, retirement, Social Security and all that is so imperative is that we have a huge manual labor underclass in this country, of which their body literally gets broken down.
When we talk about a fair fight, that means very different things within these two frameworks.
And so now he has a strange audacity to talk about a fair fight when he's talking about traditional justice being the justice that the U.S. has doled out. When has the U.S. ever doled out a fair fight? You can go back to the beginning, you can go back to Jim Crow, you can go to any island, Hawaii, Samoa, Puerto Rico, Haiti. South America is not an island. You can go anywhere. When has the U.S. ever dealt out equal justice? What is this dude talking about? Thomas Sowell is a propagandist. You're not going to learn anything from reading Thomas Sowell. In fact, you might lose your soul.
A fair fight by traditional standards.
Before it was Lake Lanier, it was a town called Oscarville, Georgia.
This means that both boxers observe the Marquis of Queensberry rules.
1969, Chairman Fred Hampton and his fiancée were in the bed sleeping when 19 officers raided their apartment, firing 99 bullets into the mattress. Chairman Hampton's fiancée, 8 months pregnant, forced to leave the room.
And the fight is fair.
Is how abstract you handle the race thing. In other words, you start out, and now y'all aren't quoting me on this. All right, I won't. You start out in 1954 by saying nigger, nigger, nigger. By 1968, you can't say nigger. That hurts your backfire. So you say stuff like forced busing, states' rights, and all that stuff.
And the fight is fair.
And you're getting so abstract now. You're talking about cutting taxes, and all of these things you're talking about are totally economic things. And the byproduct of them is blacks get hurt worse than whites.
Chairman Fred Hampton and his fiancée were in the bed sleeping.
Whether it ends up in a draw or a one-sided beating. From the other point of view, from the cosmic perspective.
Schools, everything was a problem. For example, they used to serve cookies and I think graham crackers and milk in the morning to children in primary school who had the money to pay for it. And if you didn't have the money to pay for it, you had to put your head on the desk until the other kids finished eating. I always thought that was very bad, but at the open community school, everybody eats.
It's fair only when the two fighters enter the ring with the same prospects of winning.
They want equality, period.
John Rawls has sort of summarized and epitomized these two differences. He distinguishes what he calls fair equality of opportunity from merely formal equality of opportunity. Traditional justice or fairness by Rawls' standards means simply that people are judged by the same rules.
And I feel that there is a need for a revolution of values in America, because some of the values that presently exist are certainly out of line with the values and the idealistic structure that brought our nation into being.
But genuine equality of opportunity, as he calls it, cannot be achieved by this method. Instead, he says, undeserved inequalities call for redress.
At the very same time that America refused to give the Negro any land, through an act of Congress, our government was giving away millions of acres of land in the West and the Midwest.
And obviously someone must have power in order to do that redress.
And now when we come to Washington in this campaign, we're coming to get our check.
Now, what I call cosmic justice has been called by some people social justice.
I feel that we are in the midst of the most critical period in our nation.
But I think they're unduly modest.
And the economic problem is probably the most serious problem confronting the Negro community. And I might say the most serious problem confronting poor people generally.
Because they're trying to correct not only the inequities that they see in society.
1921 Tulsa race riots has been in the news recently.
They're trying to correct the oversights of God.
Now, who have you ever heard say that they want to correct the oversights of God? See, this is something the right does all the time. They make up a boogeyman or a problem that isn't there. No one, and then let him go on.
Or the defects of the cosmos. When some people are born with physical or mental handicaps, they want to counterbalance that.
Yes, they do. Don't you?
And of course, that's not always caused by society. So that when Rawls says that undeserved inequalities.
Now we are confronting issues that cannot be solved without costing the nation billions of dollars. Now, I think this is where we're getting our greatest resistance. They may put it on many other things, but we can't get rid of slums and poverty without it costing the nation something.
It includes all sorts of things, and that opens up a very large area for others. You can find this perspective on justice, the Rawlsian perspective.
And I think the time has come to bring to bear the power of the direct action, the nonviolent direct action movement.
In many places, from the street corner community activists right up to the chambers of the Supreme Court.
And I don't want to be narrow about this, talking only about the black poor in our country, because I must be concerned about Puerto Ricans who are poor, Mexican Americans, American Indians, and Appalachian whites.
For example, a few years ago, an admissions director at Stanford University wrote a book in which she pointed out that during all her years as an admissions director, she had never required students to submit achievement tests.
Our first visit will be to California, where we'll go to the Oakland Community Learning Center. This is a school that was started by a political organization in the black community of Oakland.
Because some of those students, she said, through no fault of their own, attended schools where they could not have acquired the skills necessary to do well on such tests.
It's much easier to integrate a bus than it is to make genuine integration a reality and quality education a reality in our schools.
So she's trying to redress the inequalities, and therefore she would simply not require such tests.
Anybody can see that the schools are more segregated in the North today than they were in 1954 when the Supreme Court rendered its decision declaring segregation unconstitutional. Anybody can look around the ghetto and see that ghetto schools are predominantly segregated and devoid of quality.
The Educational Testing Service is currently engaging in a renorming of test scores to take into account the social backgrounds and handicaps of the students.
So is the teacher right just to let people in without doing the test scores? Probably not exactly. What is Thomas Sowell's, the man without one, what is his solution to the problem? Just test the kids and the ones that don't make it? He wants to standardize tests. How about we standardize schools? If we had standardized schools, if all the kids went to the greatest schools, like I live in Hawaii, we got Punahou and Iolani are our top schools. If all the schools were like that throughout the nation, then we'd find out who the smartest kids were and who could do the best. But when you have kids going to schools that don't have textbooks, or now we be on the computer more, But 10 years ago, I was at a school where they had to share the textbooks. The kids couldn't even take their textbooks home. You can't, it's not gonna work.
So that the school will then, again, redress pre-existing inequalities rather than applying the same standards to everybody.
We weren't allowed to be free to be creative, and our curiosity was, and our questions about things were slowly discouraged. Whenever I asked a question in the class, if it was an intelligent question, the teacher would think I was just trying to be smart. And I would say, be quiet, you know, or else go and sit in the corner.
Whenever I hear notions of fairness in education,
But the children in our school are free, and they ask all sort of questions.
I think back to my own education. And I think, thank God, my teachers were unfair to me when I was a kid growing up in Harlem.
It's weird, because as a parent, like, you want to hear kids out.
One of these teachers was a lady named Miss Simon, who belonged to what might be called the General Patton School of Education. I cannot even imagine that Miss Simon gave a moment's thought to my self-esteem.
It doesn't matter whether or not they're the victims of society.
And when they're having, like, some sort of anxiety, an issue, you want to talk with them, and you want to talk through it, sure. And you don't want to tell them, hey, you're going to have to suck it up.
Every word that we misspelled in her class had to be written 50 times, not in class, but as part of our homework. And there was always plenty of other homework from her and other teachers. And so you misspelled 4 or 5 words, and you had quite an evening ahead of you. Very little chance of listening to the Lone Ranger. Now, was this fair in Rawlsian terms? And the answer is no. Like many of the children in Harlem at that time, I came from a home where nobody had gone beyond elementary school.
On the basic economic conditions that we face all over the country, nonviolence has been a tremendous force in grappling with the social problem of legal segregation and the syndrome of deprivation surrounding that system.
I still remember what a big fuss was made when I was promoted to the 7th grade because I'd gone further than anyone else.
But the children in our school are free, and they ask all sort of questions, and we try to give them an answer.
In later years when I graduated from Harvard, there was no such fuss. They expected me to. But fairness was never an option.
Around the issue of segregation and voting rights, we discovered that these legislative strides did very little to improve the lot of the millions of Negroes in the ghettos of the North and in the nation generally. In other words, it did very little to penetrate the lower depths of Negro deprivation in communities all over.
There was nothing Miss Simon or anybody else could do about the fact that we came from homes where we did not have books and magazines, and we were not as familiar with those words as people from other neighborhoods might have been.
That we've got to develop in the North a massive job of organization and mobilizing forces and resources to deal with the problem in the urban ghettos of the North, just as we've done it in the South.
So that was never an option. Nothing that schools could have done would have changed that.
The other thing is that America freed the slaves in 1863 through the Emancipation Proclamation of Abraham Lincoln, but gave the slaves no land or nothing in reality, and as a matter of fact, to get started on. At the same time, America was giving away millions of acres of land in the West and the Midwest, which meant that there was a willingness to give the white peasants from Europe an economic base.
It would have been an irresponsible self-indulgence for them to have pretended to make things fair.
And yet it refused to give its black peasants from Africa who came here involuntarily in chains and had worked free for 244 years any kind of economic base.
If there's anything worse than unfairness, it is make-believe fairness.
And so emancipation for the Negro was really freedom to hunger. It was freedom to the winds and rains of heaven. It was freedom without food to eat or land to cultivate, and therefore it was freedom and famine at the same time.
They could, like the College Board apparently is trying to do, pretended that we knew more than we did.
And we try to give them an answer.
And that would have made them feel good.
But they teach us so much.
It would not have done much for us.
I think that you teach us a lot.
Instead, they forced us to meet standards that were a little harder for us to meet than they were for some other kids.
Because we need to know the things that you're thinking because you come up with fresh ideas, you see.
But far more necessary for us to meet, because that was the only way out of poverty.
So there goes one of those right-wing lies again, where it's all or nothing. So that's the only way out of poverty. Is that really the only way out of poverty?
Also this, the Rainbow Coalition comprised of black, white, and Hispanic leaders under Chairman Hampton's tutelage.
Chairman Fred was able to go out there as a realist and again grapple and deal with the race and class contradictions.
Many years later, I happened to run into one of the other kids from Harlem who went to that same school at the same time. And by now, he was a psychiatrist. He owned a home in the Napa Valley and property out there. In fact, now he's retired, living overseas with servants, while yours truly is still trying to make a living.
So Thomas Sowell ain't out here trying to make a living. Thomas Sowell, the man without one, is just trying to propagate you. He's just trying to get you to get in line and follow your masters.
But as we reminisced about things that had happened in the old days and what had happened in between, one of the things he mentioned was that over the years, his various secretaries had commented on the fact that he seldom misspelled a word. I told him that my secretaries had made that very same observation, and that if they knew Miss Simon, there would be no mystery as to why we did not misspell words. Now, it so happens I became a high school dropout.
But they were not at that moment, and they are not now, committed to genuine equality for Negroes. It's much easier to integrate a lunch counter than it is to guarantee an annual income, for instance, to get rid of poverty for Negroes and all poor people.
But what I was taught before I dropped out was enough for me to score higher on the verbal SAT than the average Harvard student, which may have had something to do with my being admitted to Harvard in an era before affirmative action was even thought of. What if the teachers of that era had been imbued with the present-day conception of fairness?
Because of all of the conditions that we've lived with and the syndrome of deprivation surrounding conditions, whether it's in housing,
Wilmington, North Carolina.
In the economic area.
A white mob hell-bent on destroying the economic power the black community built terrorized Wilmington. They destroyed property and businesses of black residents that were built up since the Civil War.
In schools, in the vicious credit practices that we faced in the ghetto.
Where would my schoolmate and I be today? On welfare, in prison, perhaps in a halfway house if we were lucky.
Again, I don't know why the right does this. Well, I know why they do it. You do it to scare people, but why would they be at a halfway house? And now he's talking about there's two people that were successful from his grade school or elementary school. What about the other kids? Were they successful? How many got successful? Did the teachers teach them right? Or they were just the lucky two that happened to get out?
And would that not have been an injustice? To take individuals capable of independent, self-supporting, and being self-directed women and men.
And when white Americans tell the Negro to lift himself by his own bootstraps, they don't look over the legacy of slavery and segregation. I believe we ought to do all we can and seek to lift ourselves by our own bootstraps. But It's a cruel jest to say to a bootless man that he ought to lift himself by his own bootstraps. And many Negroes, by the thousands and millions, have been left bootless.
It was the beginning of a racial cleansing that resulted in the expulsion of more than 1,000 black residents from Forsyth County.
As a result of all of these years of oppression and as a result of a society that deliberately made his color a stigma and something worthless and degrading.
With pride in their own achievements and turn them into dependents, clients, supplicants, mascots.
If we don't, they will, or a portion of them will, become the predators 15 years from now. And Madam President, we have predators on our streets that society has, in fact, in part because of its neglect, created.
Now, the primary purpose of mascots is to minister, to symbolize something that makes other people feel good.
And I'm like the token black or the token woman.
The actual fate of the mascot himself is seldom a major consideration.
It marked an important transformation for the Panthers' political ideals. The idea was inspired by Mao Zedong's advice to revolutionaries in the Little Red Book, and Newton called for the Panthers to serve the people and make survival programs a priority within its branches.
The argument here is not against real justice or real equality. Both of these things are desirable in themselves.
And he said, I just want to tell you, he said, nobody's going to tell us where or when we can bomb. Nobody.
The only argument is that some versions of these things are simply impossible.
Because obviously sitting around saying, we want to cut taxes, we want to cut this, and we want is much more abstract than even the busing thing. And a hell of a lot more abstract than Nigger Nigger, you know.
And that trying the impossible.
But in winning victories like the Civil Rights Bill of '64 and the Voting Rights Bill of 1965
has costs and real dangers as well.
Where he is forced to pay more for less and constantly trying to make ends meet, but because of either no job as a result of unemployment or a job that is so economically unprofitable that the person can make ends meet.
After all, the people who manned the communist movement around the world before the Soviet Union was established didn't devote themselves to this cause for the sake of creating gulags and secret police and territorial aggrandizement. They did it because they were seeking social justice.
Dozens of other black towns have been erased off the American map, not by burning them down, but by hiding them underwater.
But what actually happened shows some of the costs and some of the dangers of that. Most ordinary Americans still have the traditional conception of justice.
Take back the streets.
And that means that people who have this cosmic notion of justice,
it doesn't matter,
must misrepresent what is happening as being a violation of traditional justice.
It doesn't matter whether or not they were deprived as a youth.
And therefore they must, for example, misrepresent test results.
My name is Kalita Smith.
As being either arbitrary barriers to advancement or deliberate efforts to perpetuate inequalities.
I'm 8.5 years old. I live in Oakland, California.
As Joseph Schumpeter once said, the first thing a man will do for his ideals is lie.
A few questions for my colleagues. What if our foreign policy of the past century is deeply flawed and has not served our national security interests?
That these young people are saying that there must be a revolution of values in our country.
The next thing he will do, and this is my addendum, is character assassination.
1969, Chairman Fred Hampton and his fiancée were in the bed sleeping.
Those people who disagree with those with a vision of cosmic justice.
When 19 officers raided their apartment, firing 99 bullets into the mattress.
Must be stopped, in their view, by all means necessary.
Chairman Hampton's fiancée, 8 months pregnant, forced to leave the room.
And that, of course, includes character assassination.
I heard the sister scream. They stopped shooting. Pig said, he's good and dead now.
Chairman Hampton killed at 21 years old.
They must be bought, to use a verb of our time.
Affairs Victoria Nuland seemed to admit the quiet part out loud when it comes to United States investment in Ukraine.
By the way, we have to remember that the bulk of this money is going right back into the U.S. economy to make those weapons.
Now, the people who are the victims of this atmosphere of character assassination are not simply those who are targeted.
Destroying what is referred to as Black Wall Street. But there are also other black cities that were destroyed that are less famous than Tulsa.
The whole society is a victim.
And we are confronting a major depression in the poor community.
Because you're not going to be able to attract into the public arena people who value their privacy, who value protecting their families from humiliations, if in fact disagreements become simply grounds for smears.
We hate the oppressor, whether he be white, black, brown, or yellow. So we got to know the educational program to find out what is going to be in the finale.
A servant of the people, at age 19, Chairman Hampton fought for non-segregated swimming pools. The Panthers' free breakfast program fed 3,500 hungry kids a week. They also organized free medical clinics for minorities unable to afford other means.
In a sense, the people who are caught up in the vision of cosmic justice are also victims.
It doesn't matter whether or not they had no background that enabled them to become socialized into the fabric of society.
Because once having demonized other people,
it doesn't matter whether or not they're the victims of society.
They really cannot go back to square one and re-examine the evidence.
So I don't want to ask what made them do this. They must be taken off the street.
And find out whether what they've been advocating has been producing the results they want or producing totally different results. And so they're locked into the vision. They have too much of a stake in it to ever think about doing something different.
What if we wake up one day and realize that the terrorist threat is a predictable consequence of our meddling in the affairs of others?
I have a chapter in the book called The Tyranny of Visions.
And has nothing to do with us being free and prosperous.
About how the vision becomes more real to people than any empirical reality.
What if propping up repressive regimes in the Middle East endangers both the United States and Israel?
A classic example was one described by Paul Johnson, Lenin.
Well, there was no doubt about the hypocrisy of large segments of the nation on the whole question of racial equality.
And Johnson pointed out that Lenin, although he spoke of himself as a representative of the proletariat,
I think the best example is that many of the senators from the North and the West, and congressmen generally, who voted for civil rights legislation in '64 and even '65 with the Voting Rights Bill, refused last year to vote for civil rights legislation because it dealt with an issue applicable to the North, the whole housing question.
Had in fact never set foot in a working class neighborhood in any of the cities he'd ever been in, inside or outside of Russia. He had never talked with the workers and had no idea what they believed about anything.
What if someday it dawns on us that losing over 5,000 American military personnel in the Middle East since 9/11 is not a fair trade-off for the loss of nearly 3,000 American citizens.
And something you said that could affect American troops.
No matter how many Iraqi, Pakistani, and Afghan people are killed or displaced.
As you said, we should have kept the oil, but okay, maybe we'll have another chance.
He also, after becoming the ruler of Russia, never set foot in Soviet Central Asia, which is an area larger than all of Western Europe, and in which all these doctrinaire schemes from Moscow were imposed for nearly 3/4 of a century.
The idea was inspired by Mao Zedong's advice to revolutionaries in the Little Red Book, and Newton called for the Panthers to serve the people and make survival programs a priority within its branches.
With devastating results. What he was devoted to was the vision.
Well, we should have kept the oil when we got out.
Not flesh and blood people.
We're keeping the oil. We have the oil. The oil is secure. We left troops behind only for the oil.
Flesh and blood people were a complication on the road to realizing the vision. And as it turned out, if he had to kill a few million of those.
What if occupying countries like Iraq and Afghanistan and bombing Pakistan is directly related to the hatred directed toward us?
That was just so much too bad. And of course, we've seen Hitler, Mao, and others with the same approach.
What if we finally decide that torture, even if called enhanced interrogation technique, is self-destructive and produces no useful information, and that contracting it out to a third world nation is just as evil?
Now, fortunately, we have thus far in this country had much more milder versions of this.
During these riots, white mobs killed between 40 and 250 African Americans and left 6,000 homeless by destroying the whole black neighborhood of the city.
But you can see also this notion of looking for visions and the abstractions that go with those visions, rather than with flesh and blood people. The vision of cosmic justice is very beneficial to the people who hold it.
The end result is they're about to knock my mother on the head with a lead pipe, shoot my sister, beat up my wife, take on my sons.
Even if it's not beneficial to those whom it's intended to benefit.
What if it is finally realized that war and military spending is always destructive to the economy?
And I think that's one of the reasons that people are so reluctant to give it up.
So do they just not want bourgeois values, which after all are the basis of this democracy?
Because they feel wonderful. I'm sure that if we had had the kinds of teachers that we have today, and they had lowered the standards to all of us as we were coming through the school.
So this is more nonsense. Nobody wants to lower the standards of any school. In fact, a leftist, we want to higher the standards of every school. Like I said earlier in the video, we want every school to be like a private school, to be like the best private school. The right just makes stuff up. They just say stuff. How can you argue with something like this? Like, what does that mean? We want to lower the standards of school? Nobody wants that. Stop saying stuff that isn't real.
We're going to be meeting a student at the Learning Center, a young lady named Kalita, and when the film opens, Kalita is interviewing Huey Newton, founder of the Black Panthers.
And we all ended up going out into the world foredoomed to failure.
I go to school at the Oakland Community Learning Center.
Those teachers would have felt wonderful about themselves.
My school was started by the Black Panther Party.
Because they say, hey, we're not leaning on these poor kids. We're taking into account that they come from backgrounds that are deprived.
My school serves breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Because sometimes your mother or father or whoever you're living with probably don't have enough food for you. Some of the people who serve food are teachers.
I mean, particularly in education, this is devastating because it's been shown again and again that in one generation, people can do remarkable things with a decent education.
Now, again, on the left, we want better education from cradle to the grave. He's talking about testing, and we need kids educated. We need the best schools. Why not talk about teacher pay? Why not pay teachers more and make it, say, even harder to become a teacher so that we have real competition and we get the best teachers so then that we can have the best schools for all our kids. So he's talking about testing rather than schooling, when even to his own admission, it would only take one generation. What if it took two? Still, wouldn't schooling be more important than testing? Testing. He's just worried about fair testing. Let's get more fair education.
Jaime Escalante did this out in California with the Hispanic kids who scored so high on the calculus test that the Educational Testing Service could not believe it.
They put us in different levels based on what we can do.
So an awful lot can be done. Language, the same thing. The whole notion that you have to have bilingualism. Well, it's known from a lot of research that the child's brain is better able to assimilate languages in those first half dozen years than it will ever be able to do in later life.
The earliest age you start going to this school is when you're 2.
The brain itself metamorphoses. And if you don't learn a foreign language until you're 30, you're never going to speak it as well as if you'd learned it when you were 5. And so all these things can be done but they're not going to be done as long as third parties think that the purpose of the educational system is to make them feel good about themselves.
A legacy like none other. The Hampton House, Chairman Hampton's Maywood childhood home, now a historical landmark, distributing free clothes and food 24/7 at Proviso East High School, inside room 35, the Chairman Fred Hampton Social Justice Room for community meetings and student activities. Chairman Hampton, a 1966 graduate here, his passion, his death, continuing to inspire generations of leaders.
If you made it this far, thank you. So my attempt in this video is to show that Thomas Sowell really does not know what he's talking about so well. So if you made it to the end, much mahalos. That's thank you in Hawaiian. So if you made it to the end, thank you. Much mahalos. What I attempted to do in this video was pretty much to show that Thomas Sowell, the man without one, doesn't know what he's talking about. My attempt in this video is to show that Thomas Sowell, the man without one, doesn't know what he's talking about so well. And normally, he's so wrong. What I attempted to do in this video is use Thomas Sowell's word and then historical figures and newscasts current that show about new and old things. Like everybody knows about Tulsa, Oklahoma. If you don't know, look up Forsyth County, Georgia. Look up the Osage tribe. Look up Seneca Village. The MOVE movement in Philadelphia, 1980s. There's a lot that Thomas Sowell leaves out. There's a lot that Thomas Sowell leaves out when talking about equality or justice or both. Education and just people in general. Thomas Sowell is a propagandist who is trying to lead you to the right. He's trying to lead you away from people. He wants you to look at people as not being good enough. They didn't make it because they didn't try hard enough. That may be true for a few people, but most people try. Most people want to succeed. Most people want to be good. Most people want to do their best. Who doesn't want to eat? Who doesn't want a house? Who doesn't want a nice house? Who doesn't want a nice car? To say that people don't want to work or that they don't want to try hard is projection. That's the right projecting on you. You got Thomas Sowell. He doesn't work. All he does is talk all his life. He just talks. There's all kinds of people who talk for a living, and that's great. News people, pundits, all kinds of people that just talk for a living. But like Sagar and Jetty said earlier, some people work until their bodies break down. And talkers don't understand that.
Well, it was the era that we played in. I wish I never played in that era. I wish we had drug testing. If we had drug testing when I was playing, you and I wouldn't be having this conversation today. I'll guarantee you that.
What drugs did you use?